Some fans of the comic believe that the real reason that housing market has never defeated housing crisis is because he simply hasn't been allowed to.
Oh, there you go.
We all know that our hero's awesome powers are kept in check by his green belt of regulation.
There you go.
The
There you go, Adam.
green belt of regulation.
There you go. See, if he was more knowledgeable, he would have had a shackled leviathan that is keeping the power of housing market in check.
There we go. We got to release that. We got to get that belt off him. It's a character that you love too. But
and maybe just maybe he could defeat housing crisis if only he was allowed to take off the belt and unleash his
take off
his
that
dick?
belt and unleash. What the fuck is
Ollie's
going
like,
on?
take off that belt, buddy. Release the kraken from your pants. shove that nice housing market down my throat. Oh yeah.
Oh my God, Sitch. That's so bad.
Drown me in your liquidation of housing funds or whatever.
Oh my God.
true power. After all, as long as he wears it, his powers can wax and wane, and property developers can't always count on the stability of his heroism. But here's the thing, guys. That already happened in the comics. Over 100 years ago, during the Industrial Revolution saga, which was set in England, housing market's green belt of regulation was a lot weaker, only housing crisis wasn't defeated. If anything, he got even stronger, because most of the properties housing market was providing were dangerous, even deadly, being built mainly out of cheap materials. All this was...
So here's a big issue too. Is this entire video is about the housing crisis. Has he ever defined what the fuck the housing crisis is?
No,
that he's
not
talking
really.
about. Yes, I don't even know what he's talking. Because now he's talking about, well, wait a minute, people living
In
we assume
dangerous
he's talking about
houses?
people-
Now that's the housing crisis?
right. Yeah, because I assumed he was talking about people who couldn't afford houses or
Right.
live or are homeless. And now he's saying, well, no, if you live in a dangerous house, that's part of the housing crisis.
Right, yeah. So that thing about you talking about the developer spending too much money, he's saying, well, no, they just built it out of matchsticks and sold houses like crazy back then.
Right.
That was a
Yeah, he's
completely
saying, yeah,
different
without-
housing crisis.
Right. He's saying well, obviously there's going to be truth to that. Without regulation, people cut corners so much as it is. Without
Hell yeah.
if there's zero regulation, obviously they're going to fucking,
Yes, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Though it is pretty lame that he has to go back 100 years, like to make, I think.
Yeah,
if
it's awful.
I think you got to make a more relevant economic argument than going back to, the Industrial Revolution. But
Is he? I missed the year he's talking about, because Soul talks about that in the book about the housing crisis during the Great Depression, which ultimately led to the Nazis.
he's talking about before the Great Depression.
Right. Yes.
covered in the work of comic book lover and nerd bro Frederick Engels. And for more on why the laissez-faire fanboys are
That's Karl Marx's best buddy, right?
Yes, of course he brings up angles. Yes.
reading the comics all wrong, here's awesome nerd and comic book genius Mexi to talk about the series' #1 sexiest character.
Thanks, Niall. I just get really worked up about this laissez-faire fanboy theory that shedding the green belt of regulation is the key to defeating housing crisis.
Libertarians, shots fired.
There you go. She's making the argument, Adam.
She's taking
She's
you
coming
out.
at you.
Not me. I don't care. I don't give a fuck
Uh-huh,
about this
uh-huh.
nonsense.
Adam
This
cares.
is pure
Adam cares. No way, man. I'm all for protecting my property value. Fuck you guys.
fantasy. Not only did Nurbo Engels show us what happened when the belt was weakened during the Industrial Revolution saga, but the laissez-faire boys forget that we have a much more recent example. In issue 2016 in New York, housing market was seduced by the beguiling Airbnb, who claimed to be the secret weapon that housing market had been looking for. While their romance heated up, Airbnb convinced housing market to take long-term rentals off of the market, all while claiming that this was a great way to allow working class.
So she, just to explain what she's talking about. So long-term, I guess there was something happened in New York where long-term rentals were turned into Airbnb. So it's pretty fucked up if you're renting a unit and all of a sudden your landlord comes to you and says, "Hey, you got to move. I'm going to turn this into an Airbnb and make like 10 times as much money."
Yeah, how does that work? I'm so confused by her argument here.
You throw your tenants out. It's easy.
No, but she's
Kick
saying
them out on the street. Yeah, I don't know what
yeah,
her
but
argument
this is a very disingenuous argument because she's saying, well, wait a minute. There was in New York, they got rid of a regulation that would have protected people that were renters.
Mm-hmm.
And
that
thus
doesn't
that
increase
proves
the
that getting
volume.
regulation doesn't help the house. Like what? Like
It's regulation. There's not one regulation hammer that all regulation is the same, right?
yeah, I know, but that's what she's acting like.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a bad one to get rid of.
People to top up their income. The prices skyrocketed, people were forced out of their neighborhoods, gentrification's powers grew stronger, and more people were struck with the homelessness ray. Some super genius super fans, including the prolific Neil Smith, have uncovered that evildoer gentrification's power comes from creating what are called rent gaps, which happen when the rent that landlords are receiving stagnates while the potential economic returns of that area increase. This creates an
They can't.
Yes.
That's like rent control, right? She's basically
Right.
talking about rent control, but not saying rent control.
That is what it sounds like she's saying.
incentive for real estate capital to redevelop, to close the gap and cash in on all of that potential, which, as we know, pushes people out of their neighborhoods and makes housing less affordable. Well, there's a new theory that Airbnb is
Wait, how does that make any sense? She just said, wait. She's explained this really poorly, so maybe I'm just stupid and I don't understand what she's saying. It sounds like she's saying when you're living in an area or you're
Mhm.
renting in an area and everything in that area economically increases, but the amount of rent you're demanding from your person stays the same
Because of rent control.
because of rent control. And then you, as the renter, as the rent owner, feel like you should be inclined to charge
no.
them more. But
No, she's saying that you have the way to get around rent control is to redevelop. So you basically kick out all your tenants and you say, we're going to bulldoze this place and build something new.
I see. Okay, so what
Yeah.
she's doing is okay. So basically, what she's doing is she's complaining about gentrification, but gentrification only exists because of rent control.
Exactly.
Right, and
yeah.
she's leaving out that key comic book character of rent control.
Rent
in
control.
the situation.
Well,
Yeah.
she called it rent gap. I don't know. Maybe she doesn't want to use the language of the dirty right winger.
Well, she can't because if she says rent control, that destroys her argument. Because then you're saying, wait a minute, the government regulation of rent control is what creates the people trying to get around rent control is what creates gentrification in the first place. 'Cause that's the way this always works. There's always this arms race where the government imposes some regulation, to do X, Y, Z, and then people try to, figure out some way around it.
No regulation. All regulation is bad. You're winning me over. What did she call them?
There you go.
The laissez-faire boys.
The
The
laissez-faire boys,
laissez-faire
yeah.
boys.
also having an affair with gentrification, since Airbnb is helping gentrification to create new rent gaps out of nowhere and is also providing the means to close them.
So Airbnb is actually raising rents. Yeah, it's confusing.
That is a terrifying power. When Airbnb is in town, there is an immediate gap between the rent that landlords are getting and the potential returns they could get from switching to short-term rentals. And they don't even have to invest in redevelopment or improvement. All they have to do is evict their current tenant.
All they have to do is kick their tenant out.
Or fail to keep their long-term rental on the market when their tenant moves on. This means that Airbnb
So wait, let me go back a second. Because she finally explaining what she should have explained like at the beginning?
is in town, there is an immediate gap between the rent that landlords are getting and the potential returns they could get from switching to short-term rentals. And they don't even have to invest in redevelopment or improvement. All they have to do is evict their current tenant or fail to keep their long-term rental on the market when their tenant moves on. This means that Airbnb
So what is your response to that? Because she's saying,
Well,
okay.
I'm trying to figure out how Airbnb increases the supply, because it's a two different markets actually. It's a short-term rental
Right.
market, which is like hotels, which there's a supply of in any given city. And you would think the demand is related to like how many people want to visit that city for tourism and stuff like that. So there could be a higher demand for short-term rentals in a place, and because of government regulation, like there's not enough hotels, so the hotel prices start going up, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that
Right.
incentivizes them to say, well, listen, maybe I can make more money in this other market with my unit, turning basically my unit into a hotel. But wasn't all this started on the idea that we've already tried to increase the housing supply and that didn't lower rents? Is that what she's basically saying? Airbnb increased the housing supply and therefore that didn't solve the problem of lowering
Well,
rents?
no, she's saying in this really weird way, which I guess I don't know why they're doing such a poor job explaining. What she's saying is that there was some regulation in New York City
Mm-hmm.
that was preventing, because of zoning laws, because of those pesky zoning laws
Regulations.
that you always complain, those
I'm
horrible
telling-
government
It's
regulations.
that green belt. We just got to
That-
get him out of his,
Gotta
get his
get that
belt off.
housing market dick out. Yeah. It's because of the regulations. Okay. It was preventing people from renting out their either individual rooms or their entire properties as Airbnbs. Okay. Because of the way zoning was. And then they got rid of that regulation. And so what happened was a lot of renters realized that if they kicked out their tenants and rented the property as an Airbnb, it would make more money than it would as being a normal, I guess, apartment or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But
So, but
how
my
is
so-
that making the argument that we've already tried? Oh, I guess she's making the argument that we already tried to get rid of regulation and it didn't work.
Right. So that's what she's saying. She's saying we got rid of some sort of zoning regulation, and that actually increased the price of housing, didn't decrease the price of housing.
Right. So she's saying the laissez-faire boys are wrong, that if you got rid
Right.
of all regulation, that housing prices wouldn't go down because we got rid of this one regulation,
Right.
which is not really a great argument. If there's
Well-
like 10 regulations that are factoring into the housing market and you get rid of one and say, look, we got rid of one and housing prices went up. So therefore, if we get rid of the rest of them,
Right.
it's going to be sky high.
But that's part of, yeah, and that's true, and that's why this is that's why I think that she's making a bad argument or a bad example, because it's what you just said. But the flip side of it, it kind of creates a situation where it's like, I don't know how this could ever be tested, because I think you're right that the only way to test this is you have to have a control where there's zero regulation, because any regulation is always going to have some sort of unintended consequence. It's always going to create some domino effect that's going to create a situation that is probably going to hurt, is going to raise prices in some way that people aren't going to expect.
That's why Seoul went to the cities.
Right.
Because he's like, Houston has virtually no housing regulation whatsoever, and they're one of the least expensive housing markets in the U.S. But you're saying it's just
Who the fuck wants to live
is
in Houston?
Yeah, Sitch's whole argument is Houston is a shithole. That's his whole
look,
argument.
Who wants to live in Houston, Adam? Okay, let's be real here.
I might live in Houston soon. Jeez.
So
rent in
okay, wait a minute.
California is getting too damn high.
Population of Houston, 2.3 million. What's the population
Yeah.
of like LA?
I think it's like 3 million.
Is it only 3 million?
I don't know.
No, it's 10 million.
10 million. Oh my God.
See, but this is what I'm saying. Okay, like I don't know what the landmass comparison is between Houston and LA, right? Because that I also have to factor. Like, what's the population density between Houston and LA? What's the population density between New York and LA?
We got plenty of room to build. I'm serious. We got plenty of room to build. We do.
No, but they've already done that in LA, and it just doesn't seem like it makes so much of a difference, does
There's
it?
empty lots in LA. There's all kinds of
Okay.
empty lots in LA. There's
There
lots
you
of
go.
places you could build in LA.
There you go. You just gotta cut government regulations, and it's gonna solve everything.
Yeah.
Solve everything like
Bullshit.
magic.
I
Just gotta get.
I would
Adam wants to
build
get
like
the
a
housing
whole
market dick.
condominium complex on my property. It'd be great.
Adam wants to
A
just
skyscraper.
gingerly wrap his hands around housing market's belt and just
Fuck.
slowly pull that belt
I'm
off, and he just
spank him.
wants to,
I'm gonna spank him with that fucking
Adam
regulation.
wants to slip his hands into housing market's pants and just gingerly just feel the shaft of the housing market
You're
and just
so
get
gay.
it
You're
so
gay.
big and so big and unregulated. Yes,
You're so,
this is what you want, Adam.
you're
I'm just
so
saying what you
awful.
want. Well, look, I was accused on Twitter of our stream being homophobic. So I feel like
Oh, we're definitely over it now. Like
I feel like I have to go in the extreme opposite direction now. that
who
I've been
accused you of being
homophobia.
homophobic?
I don't know. Some random fucking person on Twitter.
What?
Who
Because you
knows?
said gay one time.
I don't know. They gave no example.
Oh.
I have no. First of all, I don't think I've ever used gay as an insult.
You
on
use
stream.
gay all the time.
No, I've
You
never
do.
said that.
You always say
That's
that's
a
gay.
lie. That's a lie.
But most of
That's
the time,
fake.
you're talking about things that really are gay, like
Well, so there you
like
go.
getting
see?
your hands around housing market's dong.
There you go.
Yeah, that's literally gay.
That's the fan art we want to see. I want to see Adam trying to take housing market's pants off.
No.
And
no.
see, that's the fan art. Adam's trying to pull housing market's pants off, and I'm like running at him with a bunch of belts, like trying to belt them back on.
I'm thinking of getting down with Airbnb for a bit here. Let's look
There
at
you
this.
go.
Holy
Look
cow.
at that. There you go. Yeah.
Come on home with me, Airbnb. Why are you hanging out with gentrification when you could be hanging out with me?
You don't hang out with that Colonel Sanders looking motherfucker.
I know,
You want
look
a
at
nice
him.
piece of the A team.
Look,
at
he's
that.
He's so old, he wears his boxer briefs over his pants. He doesn't even
That's
know what he's
right.
doing.
He needs he has to wear an adult diaper on the outside because he can't control anything.